In this episode of Idioms of Normality, brought to you by Future Frame TV, I'll be talking with Dr. Siobhan Irving. We talk about sex, we talk about religion. It's a fascinating discussion, so join us. Welcome to Idioms of Normality, brought to you by Future Frame TV. I'm here with Dr. Siobhan Irving, as well as all the native birds of the central coast of New South Wales. Welcome, Dr. Siobhan Irving.
Thank you for having me.
Now, before I jump into our first question, I'd like to ask you, what are the perspectives and experiences that you bring to the question, what is normal?
Professionally, I'm an anthropologist, so I study a range of human behavior, some of which might be described as normal from the inside of the community, some of which might not be. On a more personal level, though, I have breached lots of categories of normality throughout my life, and likewise, I also maybe selectively conform to other categories of normality. Just to give you an illustration of what I'm talking about, on a personal level, my father is Latino, my mother is white. Living between those two kind of identity categories has sometimes been it felt a bit like walking a tightrope, because what is normal in one category or one cultural group is definitely not normal in another. So I bring both my own personal experience and professional experience to this discussion.
Fascinating. I look forward to learning more about this. But I'm going to jump in with the first question. What is normal?
Well, the simple answer is whatever is normal is what's been decided to be normal.
What has been decided to be normal, and who decides?
Well, the particular cultural or community group that you're talking about at any particular time. So I wouldn't say that you can define normal, or you can pin a definition of normal to a particular group or a particular cultural group. Because within the cultural group, there's always all kinds of variety and diversity.
Yeah.
What's normal in your family might not be normal as what is considered normal in my family, even though we might share the exact same cultural background.
Absolutely, yeah.
So normality is something that's agreed upon. It's something that a community or a family or a whole nation or a whole region even arrives at by agreement.
When you say by agreement, are there power differentials in how those agreements come into place?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's the story of marginality, right? Of course, not always, but in a lot of ways. So, for example, I think what you see is, and you can see examples of this in how accepted norms change, right, throughout time in a particular place. Say, for example, up until very recently, same-sex marriage was not a norm. It wasn't accepted as something normal. And until it could become accepted as something normal, it couldn't be legalized, right? That norm had to become something that was increasingly accepted, same-sex partnerships had to become increasingly accepted, had to become less stigmatized through that acceptance, and then, only then, it could become a legal possibility, right, for same-sex partners to become married. And how does that acceptance come about? Well, it comes about through the acceptance of particular actors in a community, right, or in a society, people with power. And unfortunately, I think this is the reason why there are still some, like if you want to talk about relationship styles or ways of loving people, is for the same reason that less empowered people maybe have their relationship forms not accepted. Like polyamory.
Okay.
Polyamorous unions are still something that a lot of people have issues with, right? It's not something that's accepted as normal. Even in quite diverse friendship circles, people who consider themselves quite progressive, on the most part, if you announce that you're polyamorous to a group of people that don't already know you, that's going to raise some eyebrows at least. They might be okay with it in that they won't perhaps stigmatize you for it, but it's still not normal.
Yeah, there's something jarring about it for some groups of people to accept something like polyamory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would hazard, okay, this is me like putting on my opinion hat. I have no data really to back this up with, but I would hazard a guess that if we had some high profile people in a society become openly polyamorous, in the same way that we had high profile people in society model same-sex partnerships, that style of relationship would become more widely accepted. People will accept what they can see, and people will feel that they have license to be what they can see also. But to do that, to see that, to be that, you need a degree of visibility, and power makes that visibility so much easier.
And certain powers can also render things illegal and invisible because of what they determine is right and what is wrong. I think what's interesting to use sexuality and to use relationships and to use marriage as an example, particularly in Australia, is, some people suggested this is a human rights debate, whereas Australian politicians went to a popular vote on the matter. And I think it's really interesting the process by which certain behaviours can be normalised as well. And there's a process that can change according to context as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting. You mentioning popular vote versus do we decide that this is a human rights issue. The fact of putting it up to a popular vote, the marriage plebiscite in 2017, I think it was, is based on the assumption that a human right, something as fundamental as who you can legally bind yourself to, is up for debate. And I think that's a profound point. That's if you fall on the wrong side of it, profoundly, potentially hurtful point. And the fact that we put something like that up for debate as a society, I think says a lot about Australia, and it says a lot about who we believe we can, or the fact that we even believe we can, that we are legitimate in extending rights to some but not to others, simply because, by consensus, because we agree on it or not.
Yeah. What are the relationships, do you think? And this might be a bit of a stretch of a question, but what are the relationships between rights and normality? Just because something is normal, does that necessarily make it right? Or the inverse, just because something is abnormal or determined abnormal by a community, does that make it not right?
Well, at this moment, I have to channel one of my anthropological heroes here, Ruth Benedict, who I believe she wrote that what is habitual becomes accepted as what's morally good. So there can be a tendency within a society to look at what you're surrounded by, the mundane, the everyday, what is normal to you, and assume that that is the moral good. So if you translate this to our previous discussion about marriage, relationships, then heteronormativity becomes accepted as the de facto moral good, because that's what's most common. But really, it's just statistical distribution. Commonality of something doesn't tell you anything about what is morally right or morally wrong. It only tells you what's common.
Yeah.
And you can't really extrapolate very much from that.
Yeah, it's a measure of frequency. It's not a measure of ethical orientation.
No, absolutely not. But unfortunately, I believe that Ruth Benedict, the anthropologist, she was onto something. We, as in societies in general, human beings, do have a tendency to moralize what's common, to accept what's common to us, what's familiar as being the right way. And when we see something that deviates from that, something that's not quite normal, we tend to be very suspicious of it, and we are skeptical at best, suspicious and skeptical at best, or we condemn it at worst.
How has anthropological training equipped you with an ability to engage with practices that might be unfamiliar to you and in some ways not necessarily normal to your orientation towards the world?
Oh, well, it's helped me overcome a lot of struggles. A lot of my research has actually touched on issues of sexuality and religion. And these are two topics that can be very polarizing. So sometimes I might be having a chat with a research participant, much like we're chatting right now, And I might be confronted with that person's views who might seem unusual to me, or might seem unethical to me, or might even be personally hurtful to me. I've met lots of people who were Islamophobic, who were homophobic, who were maybe violently opposed to something that I personally hold very important. And anthropological training has helped me take a step back. And instead of condemning that person for being different to me or holding views that I perceive to be immoral or unusual and maybe damaging, anthropological training has helped me take a step back from that and instead try to explore why is that person thinking the way they do, and trying to understand what the world looks like from that person's point of view. So instead of just thinking, oh, wow, you have really toxic ideas, and I think that's just dreadful that you see the world that way. Instead of coming to that conclusion, I'll try to instead maybe shelve my own personal feelings for a minute and try to think, okay, well, that's interesting. What brought you to that conclusion? What brought you to that point of view? What has happened to you, or what have you observed in the world around you that brought you to think the way you do?
You mentioned religion as well. What influence does religion, or do different religions have on people's relationship with normality?
That's a hard question because it's impossible to generalize.
Sure.
So sometimes people look at religion as a kind of blueprint that controls people. But the fact is, any acceptance of any religious tradition, we could be talking about a very scripturally bound religion like Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, or you could be talking about an oral tradition or a tradition that's much more loosely organized, like bhakti, devotional Hinduism, right? So something that's much less, we might say, textually prescriptive. But regardless of what tradition you follow, you learn and interpret the information that's presented to you about your religion. You, to an extent, will always accept things the way that you feel is right to accept them. There's all kinds of factors that go into that. Your upbringing, the culture you live in, your level of education. There's all kinds of things that inform that. But ultimately, it's a very personal thing. So it's a mistake to look at religion as a kind of blueprint that controls people. Because how can it control? You are taught your religion by others, or you're taught your religion by reading a book. But ultimately, it's you that needs to assimilate that information. It's you that needs to synthesize that and make sense of it to yourself. So it's for everyone. I believe it's a very personal thing. So how does religion translate into understandings of normality? Well, that really depends on the individual.
I think it's an interesting distinction that you point out about the textual religions, but also the more fluid religions, shamanic practices or Hindu practices. And people can be quite selective about what they will take on board about their own religion and what they'll overlook, which is why you can have such diversity within particular religions as well. I'm wondering, though, if people turn to religion sometimes for a sense of normality. If there's a sense of certainty or normality that religion can offer that people will appropriate, perhaps during times of stress or during times of perhaps seeking for some outward stability.
Oh, yes, I would agree with that 100%. If times are uncertain or scary, like they are now, it's impossible to read news, to turn on your TV without hearing awful stories of terrible things happening throughout the world. I mean, right now we're in the middle of a global pandemic, right? People are feeling scared. And I agree with you that can be a motivator to look for certainty in this very uncertain world. And the comfort that comes from that, well, you can't speak for other people, right? But there obviously is a lot of comfort because the secularization theory hypothesis didn't happen. The world is not becoming more secular. People are still there's still no shortage of followers of religion. Religion didn't fall out of favor with modernity like many people had predicted it would. So there obviously is a draw there. And yes, a religious community can model a kind of normality that people will find attractive and want to be part of, for sure.
So we've talked about normality in relation to sex and relationships, and we've talked about normality in relation to religion as well. Do you think there are any other topics to which you'd like to talk about in relation to normality?
It's important for anyone who worries that they might not be normal. Now, with the exception of medical categories, I mean, if you have a lump growing somewhere, yeah, you probably want to get that checked out. But psychologically, or in terms of your passions, in terms of what you're into, in terms of whatever makes you smile when you talk about it, if you're worried that that's not normal, I think people should take heart that it might not be normal yet. People tend to look for acceptance, tend to look for community. And if anybody happens to feel like they just haven't found theirs, or they feel like they would like to know that there were other people out there like them, but haven't come across that yet, I would encourage that person or people to keep looking. Because whatever might not be normal now, or where you are, doesn't mean that it's not normal somewhere else, or perhaps even in future.
Yeah, so normal changes according to context, according to time.
A very, very plastic category. It changes all the time, and you don't have to look very far to see so many examples of that.
So what questions do you think we should ask about normality moving forward and moving into the future? How can we embrace this kind of a diversity, and what questions should we be asking to perhaps appease people's relationship to normality?
I think we should be asking the question of what aspects of normality currently today hurt people. What is it that we accept as normal, that we don't question because we've been surrounded by it since the day when we were born? What aspects of our current everyday normality is actually hurtful and that we should be questioning? Things like, I promise you I won't go on a big anti-capitalist rant, but our neoliberal way of doing things is harmful to some people. Some of the dogmas that we unquestioningly, or many times unquestioningly, accept cause real harm. And it's good to step back a little bit from your own cultural group or from your own society and think, what might I be doing that from another perspective looks really weird or harmful? Or how is my everyday normality actually maybe hurting people?
I love that question. What are the practices that we consider normal that are hurting other people that we might not be realizing? Dr. Siobhan Irving, thank you so much for joining us on Future Frame TV for this episode of Idioms of Normality. It's been really enlightening chatting with you.
Thank you, Paul.